Donie, thank you very much for joining me. Full transparency, Donie and I have known each other for a while. We like to spend some time together talking about disinformation. So I thought Donie, who works at CNN and covers disinformation as a beat, would be a great person to have a conversation with about the work that he does every day. So Donie, do you just want to give us a quick sense of like, what do you do on a daily basis at CNN?
Sure, Claire. Well, when I joined CNN about 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years ago now, I was basically working on their breaking news desk, and I was verifying social media content from breaking news stories in both the US and in the Middle East and all around the world. So, sort of, videos and images are often posted in the middle of a breaking news situation, which are either mischaracterized or just totally false or from a different situation. So part of my job was trying to figure out, what was real and what was fake there, and how we could track down the people who were posting those videos and pictures, and getting them on air as witnesses or using their content on air and on digital. And then after the 2016 election, in January 2017, the U.S. intelligence community put out a report that said, the Russians had tried to meddle in the U.S. election, and that they had used social media to try to do it. And that's when some of my bosses at CNN sort of looked around the place and said, "Hey, you social media guy, can you find these Russian trolls?" So my job sort of turned into, trying to track down what was this disinformation campaign throughout, 2017. And we did some stories on that, but that's sort of now sort of transitioned into a full-time role and full-time piece, which primarily focuses on disinformation and how social media platforms are being used to sort of warp democracies.
So it's a random Wednesday and you come into work. I mean, how do you start looking into this? How do you discover problematic content? What kind of tools do you use?
Yeah, I mean, it's there's obviously there's a lot going on, and for me, it's sort of I don't really rely on one tool or one set of, yeah, sort of keyword searches as much as I probably did in the breaking news environment. There are sort of accounts that I suspect might be run by various different actors that over the years I've sort of built into private lists on Twitter, and I'm monitoring them to see how they're sort of shaping the discussion. But I sort of keep very close contact with people working across academia, people working in the private sector, and people who are who work for Congress, people who are sort of monitoring disinformation, as well as folks inside the social media platforms. And sort of from basically being all day on Signal, checking in with each of them pretty much daily to see what they're seeing, and then I'll do sort of my own sweep of to see what's going on. But more and more it's sort of relying on folks to bring stuff for me, and then I will dig into it. I know some of my colleagues who probably do it better than I do. They are quite regimented, and they will go through certain subreddits every day, for instance, the Donald, and then also have lists of both right wing and left wing accounts on Twitter and Facebook, and sort of go through those every day. That's not a sort of routine that I've developed yet. I probably should, but sometimes we're working on breaking news stories or in the middle of a sort of longer investigative piece, so it's sort of hard to pin that down every day.
And so, as you said, you've got many sources in different places, but you're actually, as somebody who's covering disinformation, when do you work out that it's a story? And when do you sometimes think, is this responsible to give additional oxygen to these trolls or to these networks? I mean, you probably have to make these kind of decisions quite regularly.
Yeah, I can't remember who said called it strategic silence some time back, but that's a very important part of all of this, in that, and I think the sort of bigger the news organization you're at, the bigger the platform you have, the more you have to take a pause and say, okay, well, there is this story, this narrative developing online, which is bullshit. But it looks like it's becoming a big thing online. It's got 4,000 or 5,000 retweets. But as reporters with this global platform, if we report on it, even if we're trying to dismiss it and debunk it, are we just actually, in fact, amplifying the lie. And that's very much a case by case basis, I think. I think where we sort of will certainly jump in is when a social media incident is sort of driving, or social media is sort of driving, the narrative of political debate and from one week or the other. So around, there was some suspicious activity around released memo. There was also a lot of questionable activity, I guess, around the incident at Lincoln Memorial a few months ago, where with the high school teenagers and a Native American. So that's where we'll sort of really try and dig in, and if we can provide clarity to folks, we will. And then other times, there's sort of the bigger sort of disinformation networks of accounts and pages that we will spend some time digging into. What we sort of moved away from is, I think a lot of people are still very much focused on, bots are amplifying X, Y, and Z. But the fact of the matter is that now is sort of just a part of the social media landscape, and there are things being amplified on all different sides by God knows who the actors are at times. So, and I think that can be dangerous too. For instance, there's, I think, a narrative that for some US presidential candidates, namely Tulsi Gabbard, I'll see a lot of people saying, "Oh, these Russian bots are amplifying her messages and accounts," but and there might be truth to that, but right now I have seen no conclusive evidence of that. And I think if you were to look at anybody closely enough, you'd probably see there's some very questionable behavior around all these candidates' tweets, and it likely has absolutely nothing to do with the campaign or their involvement. So, I think we have to be extremely careful in how we report and attribute this stuff.
And so you've kind of touched on that, but you're somebody who kind of started as a breaking news expert, verifying social media. You're now doing this work. But how do you think this kind of online investigation segues into offline reporting methodology? I mean, how do you see these two things working together?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for their open source, sort of news gathering, which we do, and, the data analysis we do on sort of, tweets and on Facebook posts and everything is extremely important. But I think in order to cover, this comprehensively now, it has to be a combination of both open source and traditional reporting. And I think, actually where academia probably falls down quite a bit is we'll see these massive, expansive studies on, the behavior of bots on social media. And folks will say, and they're Russian. We think they're Russian because they're pushing a Russian narrative. But frankly, you have no idea who's behind the accounts unless you have sources that have information that is not in the public domain, which is, if you have sources on Twitter or Facebook who can actually see, the IP addresses, even times they're often masked, of who's actually running the account, or folks in the intelligence community. So I think what we're seeing now is folks who just rely on open source data in this environment are doing important work, but the conclusions they're jumping to are conclusions they shouldn't be jumping to. So I think it's very important to either, if you're a reporter who's focused very much on data and open source, to either team up with somebody who sort of gets what you do, and they can, and they might have sources elsewhere, or sort of try to do a hybrid where you both have sources and you're trying to juggle the open source work.
And so that many people who are taking this course might be journalism students or kind of early to this. What kind of skills would you say journalists have to have now, journalism students have to have before they graduate?
So, I mean, I think a very important skill, particularly for like the most entry level jobs in journalism, or for internships and things, is like the sort of way I went through. And I mean, I only started, reporting like probably 7 years ago. But that sort of first news desk role where you come in and you're working on the breaking news desk often. I think a real shortage, a skill set deficit there is people who can come in and can, really quickly figure out what's real and what's fake in a breaking news situation, and being able to dig into the accounts behind it to see if they are actually legitimate or not. I think that is hugely important in, news organizations, and that's really sought after. So, I think as you're going to newsrooms, if you can say, yes, I can, sort of help, filter through all this mess in breaking news, I think folks would really like that. In terms of sort of more broadly, I mean, I can't code. I'm not a coder or developer or anything like that, despite the glasses. But I sort of, I get, I think I get and understand like enough of the techie stuff that I can have a somewhat, and my colleagues might disagree, but somewhat coherent conversation with, sort of our data team and data scientists, where I can say, okay, I think we should approach this data set in this way because this is what I'm trying to get out of the story. So I think having, I don't think it's good enough now to say, well, I want to be a writer, so I don't need to understand how, the data people do the data stuff. I think, whatever end you're on it, I think you now need to have at least some knowledge and understanding and appreciation for, what your colleagues are doing, because that's ultimately how you're going to, achieve stories.
That's great. And I think both you and I, who often do guest lectures and journalism schools, would say there's not enough of this kind of content in the curriculum, and there needs to be more.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, it's, I think probably part of that is because, a lot of the folks, a lot of the accomplished and esteemed journalists who work at J schools, they're accomplished and esteemed because they've been doing it for decades. So they didn't really grow up in an era where they had to do this work. So, I mean, I think anybody that comes in that really understands, the importance and can translate to the rest of the newsroom and to editors to say, okay, this is why this account you shouldn't trust, and this is why this account you should trust, and to be able to, articulate that in a clear way, I think is so valuable.
Great. Thank you, Donie. I'm sure you've got some disinformation to snip out. So I'll say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah.
Bye.